The date is October 25th, 1944. The location is the Philippine Sea, just off the coast of Samar. To understand the sheer magnitude of what is about to happen, we must first look at the geopolitical chessboard. The Pacific War has reached its crescendo. The United States has returned to the Philippines, fulfilling General Douglas MacArthur's promise. In Leyte Gulf, the largest amphibious invasion force in history, up to that point, is unloading thousands of troops and millions of tons of supplies. This is the juggernaut of American industrial capability, a logistics train stretching back to San Francisco. But there is a fatal flaw in this massive operation. The protection of these beachheads relies entirely on the assumption of total naval superiority. That assumption is about to be shattered. At 6:58 a.m., the sun is rising over a calm sea. Aboard the destroyer escort USS Samuel B. Roberts, lookouts scan the horizon. The Roberts, known affectionately by her crew as the Sammy B, is a tiny ship. She displaces a mere 1,745 tons. She was built quickly, cheaply, and effectively, a product of the American strategy of mass production over bespoke engineering. Her crew of 224 sailors has been together for exactly 5 months and 27 days. They are essentially civilians in uniform, many fresh out of high school, trained to hunt submarines, not to fight a surface war. But as the mist clears 15 miles to the northwest, the blood drains from the face of the lookout. Emerging from the horizon are the pagoda masts of the Imperial Japanese Navy's center force. Leading this formation is the Yamato. To call the Yamato a ship is an understatement. She is a floating fortress, the pinnacle of naval architecture, displacing 72,000 tons. She is heavier than the entire American task unit combined. Her 9 18.1-inch guns are the largest ever mounted on a warship, capable of hurling a shell the weight of a compact car over 25 miles. This is not a fair fight. It is an execution waiting to happen. The Japanese force consists of 4 battleships, 6 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 11 destroyers. Their total tonnage exceeds 200,000 tons. Opposing them is Taffy 3, a small unit of 6 slow escort carriers, screened by 3 destroyers and 4 destroyer escorts, including the Roberts. The Japanese outweigh the Americans by a factor of 8 to 1. Strategically, this should not be happening. Admiral William Halsey, commanding the powerful Third Fleet, was supposed to be the shield guarding the northern flank. But in a calculated gamble, or perhaps a catastrophic error, Halsey has taken every single American battleship north, chasing a decoy fleet of Japanese carriers that had little to no aircraft left. He has left the San Bernardino Strait unguarded. Japanese intelligence, often underestimated, had executed a brilliant feint. Under the cover of darkness, at 3 a.m., the center force slipped through the strait undetected. They were supposed to be retreating. Instead, they were closing in at 30 knots to sever the American supply line at Leyte. On the bridge of the Roberts, Lieutenant Commander Robert Copeland picks up the intercom microphone. He is a reservist, a lawyer in civilian life, not a career warrior. But in this moment, he displays a clarity of mind that rivals the greatest admirals in history. He understands the physics of the engagement instantly. The Japanese battleships can make 30 knots. His escort carriers can make 18 knots at best. They cannot run. If the Japanese reach the transport ships at Leyte Gulf, the massacre will be absolute. Tens of thousands of American soldiers on the beach will be cut off and bombarded. The only thing standing between a strategic catastrophe for the Allied war effort and the Japanese fleet is Copeland's tiny tin can destroyer. Copeland speaks to his crew. He does not offer false hope. He tells them, "This will be a fight against overwhelming odds from which survival could not be expected." It is a chilling admission. In modern naval doctrine, destroyer escorts are designed to screen convoys against submarines. They have thin hulls, unshelled plating just 3/8 of an inch thick, barely enough to stop a machine gun round, let alone a 14-inch high-explosive shell. Charging a battleship in a destroyer escort is akin to charging a tank with a bicycle. Yet, the logic of war dictates that they must trade their lives for time. The Japanese center force is a terrifying display of sunk-cost economics. The Empire of Japan has poured a significant percentage of its national GDP into these ships. They are the pride of a nation that is slowly losing the war of attrition. For the Japanese commanders, this is the show-go plan, the victory operation. It is a suicide mission for the fleet. A final attempt to force a negotiated peace by bleeding the Americans dry. They see the tiny American ships and assume they are the vanguard of Halsey's main fleet. They do not realize they are facing the naval equivalent of a picket fence. At 7:05 a.m., Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague, commanding Taffy 3, makes the only call available to him. He orders his screen to attack. It is a desperate maneuver to generate smoke and confusion. 3 destroyers, Johnston, Howell, and Heermann, turn their bows toward the enemy Leviathans. Behind them, the destroyer escorts follow. The Samuel B. Roberts is last in line. As the ship heels over, turning toward the giants on the horizon, the crew prepares for the impossible. They have minutes before the Japanese fire control radars lock onto them. The question isn't whether they will win. The question is how long they can keep the Yamato occupied before they die. Below the waterline, deep within the steel belly of the Roberts, the battle was not visible, but it was felt. Chief Engineer Lieutenant Lloyd Trowbridge listened to Commander Copeland's grim announcement over the intercom. In the engine room, the reality of naval warfare is reduced to pressure gauges, RPMs, and heat. Navy regulations were explicit. The Roberts was limited to a flank speed of 24 knots. Beyond that, safety mechanisms were designed to trip, preventing the boilers from exceeding their design specifications and exploding. These regulations were written by engineers in Washington to ensure the longevity of the vessel over a 20-year service life. Trowbridge knew they didn't have 20 years. They likely didn't have 20 minutes. He walked to the main control panel, a complex array of valves and switches, and began a procedure that was strictly court-martial material in peacetime. He bypassed every safety governor the Navy had installed. He wired the safeties down. The crew watched him in silence. They understood the calculus. The survival of the ship now depended entirely on raw speed. If the boilers blew, they died. If they didn't go fast enough, they died. At 7:23 a.m., Copeland ordered flank speed. Trowbridge's modifications unleashed the full fury of the steam plant. The Roberts surged to 28 knots, 4 knots faster than she was ever built to go. The ship began to vibrate violently, metal groaning under the torque, steam pressure gauges climbing past the red line into the danger zone. Speed was life. On the surface, The destroyer Johnston had already opened the ball. At 7:16 a.m., she fired on the lead Japanese cruiser. The enemy response was immediate and terrifying. The battleship Congo fired her 14-inch main guns. These shells, weighing as much as a motorcycle, slammed into the ocean, erupting water columns 200 feet high, taller than the Johnston's mast. The destroyer vanished into the spray and smoke, leading many to believe she was gone. But the Roberts was next. She turned her bow toward the enemy, entering a tactical engagement that defied all logic of naval supremacy. The Japanese fleet was spread across 10 miles of ocean, a massive, sweeping formation designed to envelope and crush. The super-battleship Yamato anchored the center, an unstoppable force of steel, but the immediate threat came from the flanks. The heavy cruiser Chikuma was leading the right flank, 8 miles ahead of the battleship, followed closely by the cruiser Tone. To the left, cruisers Haguro and Chokai were closing the pincers. Between them, destroyers formed a dense screening line. Strategically, this formation was a kill box. The Japanese doctrine relied on using these heavy cruisers as the tip of the spear, using their speed and heavy 8-inch guns to cripple enemy vessels before the battleships moved in for the coup de grace. For the Roberts, the geometry of the battle was a nightmare. Her primary offensive weapon against a capital ship was her torpedoes. She carried 3 Mark 15 torpedoes. To use them, she had to get within 5,000 yards, roughly 2.8 miles. However, the Japanese ships could accurately hit a target from 25,000 yards. This created a death zone of nearly 10 miles that the Roberts had to cross while under concentrated fire. The math was simple and brutal. For every mile the Roberts advanced, the Japanese fleet could fire 5 minutes' worth of heavy ordnance at her, without her being able to return a single effective shot. It was a gauntlet of steel. At 7:32 a.m., the gauntlet began. Shells started raining down around the destroyer escort. These weren't just explosions. They were information. The Japanese used colored dye markers in their shells, green, yellow, red, to help their spotters identify whose shots were landing where. The ocean around the Roberts began to turn a sickly green as 8-inch rounds from the heavy cruiser Chikuma bracketed the ship. One shell landed just 50 yards off the port bow. Another struck 20 yards to starboard. The concussions lifted the 1,700-ton ship out of the water. Copeland, displaying nerves of steel, ordered a tactic known as chasing the salvos. He ordered hard left rudder, then hard right, steering the ship toward the splashes of the last enemy shells, gambling that the Japanese gunners would correct their aim and overcompensate. He was playing a psychological game with the enemy fire control officers, forcing their mechanical rangefinders to constantly recalibrate. While Copeland danced with death on the bridge, Gun Captain Lieutenant William Burton stood in the forward 5-inch gun mount. This was the primary battery of the Roberts. His crew had trained together for 6 months, firing thousands of practice rounds, but always with the mindset of anti-submarine warfare. Their gun was designed to shoot at surfaced U-boats or slow-moving aircraft, not heavy cruisers protected by belt armor. Burton faced a logistical crisis that underscored the economic asymmetry of the fight. He had 608 rounds of ammunition, total 304 per gun. The forward gun could fire 15 rounds per minute with a well-trained crew. And Burton had a very well-trained crew. But a simple calculation revealed the terrifying timeline. At maximum rate of fire, the Roberts would run completely dry of ammunition in just 20 minutes. If Burton didn't conserve his rounds, the Roberts would be defenseless long before the battle was decided. Inside the mount, the crew of 10 men, loader, rammer, powderman, fuse setter, trainer, pointer, and gun captain, prepared to do their job. Their average age was just 22. Most were from small towns across America. Drafted into a global conflict they were now seeing face to face. 2 of them had never seen combat before today. The other 8 had only fought submarines. But submarines didn't shoot back with 14-inch guns. At 7:38 a.m., Copeland's voice crackled over the intercom again. They were closing for a torpedo attack. The Roberts was currently 7,000 yards from the heavy cruiser Chikuma. They were still too far. They needed to close another 2,000 yards to ensure a hit. At 28 knots, that meant 2 more minutes of running straight into the teeth of the enemy fire. 2 minutes doesn't sound like a long time, unless you are in a tin can taking fire from a heavy cruiser. One direct hit from an 8-inch shell would not just damage the Roberts. It would eviscerate her. The ship's hull plating was so thin that rifle fire could penetrate it. An armor-piercing shell from the Chikuma would punch through the forward gun mount like paper, detonating inside and instantly vaporizing all 10 men of Burton's crew. As the range closed, the Roberts was no longer just a ship. She was a manned projectile, hurled at the Empire of Japan in a final act of defiance. At 7:40 a.m., the Samuel B. Roberts crossed the invisible threshold. They were now inside 5,000 yards of the heavy cruiser Chikuma. This was the firing solution. Lieutenant Commander Copeland did not hesitate. He ordered the torpedo tubes fired. 3 Mark 15 torpedoes hissed out of their tubes on the starboard side, splashing into the Philippine Sea. These weapons were the destroyer's Sunday Punch. Complex machines costing thousands of dollars each, designed to break the keel of a capital ship. White wakes traced across the water at 46 knots, drawing a lethal geometric line toward the enemy cruiser. The travel time to target was approximately 2 minutes, where the fate of the engagement hung in the balance. As soon as the fish were away, the Roberts executed a violent maneuver. Copeland ordered a hard left rudder, reversing course to flee back toward the smoke screen laid by the escort carriers. The ship listed heavily, engines screaming as she sought the safety of the artificial fog. Behind them, the Japanese lookouts on the Chikuma spotted the incoming wakes. The reaction was instantaneous and drastic. The Japanese captain ordered an emergency turn to port. The cruiser's massive rudder swung over, and 15,000 tons of warship heeled sharply, breaking its attack run to comb the tracks of the torpedoes. Here, we see the intersection of American industrial failure and tactical brilliance. The Mark 15 torpedo was notorious for its unreliability, a scandal of the Bureau of Ordnance that persisted for much of the war. The contact exploders had a failure rate approaching 40%. The first torpedo passed 50 yards ahead of Chikuma's bow. The second missed the stern. The third reportedly ran underneath the cruiser without detonating. The Roberts had just fired 3 duds. In a purely material sense, the attack was a failure. But in the strategic calculus of the battle, Copeland had achieved something far more valuable than a hole in a cruiser's hull. He had bought time. By forcing the Chikuma to turn away, he had compelled the enemy to break off its pursuit of the carriers. The cruiser was now heading northwest, away from Taffy 3. She had lost 5 minutes of pursuit time. In the brutal logistics of an interception battle, 5 minutes is an eternity. It allowed the slow-moving American carriers to open the distance south, inching closer to potential rescue. Copeland had traded 3 defective metal tubes for 5 minutes of survival for thousands of men. It was an asymmetric exchange of the highest order, but the respite was short-lived. At 7:45 a.m., the Roberts emerged from the smokescreen like a prizefighter returning to the ring. The Chikuma had completed her evasive circle and resumed her course. Now, 8,000 yards away. The range was too long for torpedoes. But Copeland wasn't done. He ordered Lieutenant Burton to open fire with the forward 5-inch gun. The engagement that followed defies the laws of physics and naval tonnage. Burton's gun mount rotated, the barrel elevating to its maximum limit. The first 54-pound shell left the muzzle at 2,600 feet per second. The flight time was 12 seconds, a long arc over the ocean. It landed 400 yards short. Burton adjusted. The second shot landed 200 yards short. The third splashed near the bow. The fourth shot hit. The shell struck Chikuma's forward superstructure, penetrating the unarmored bridge area and detonating. Smoke poured from the impact point. It was a stunning achievement. A destroyer escort, designed to protect merchant ships, was landing punches on a heavy cruiser. Inside the forward mount, Burton's crew settled into a mechanical trance. Load, ram, fire. Load, ram, fire. The rhythm was dictated by the machinery and the adrenaline. 15 rounds per minute. The gun barrel began to heat up, the paint blistering. The recoil mechanism cycled violently every 4 seconds, throwing brass casings onto the deck until they piled up around the crew's ankles. After just 5 minutes of continuous fire, Burton had expended 75 rounds, 5% of his total magazine. He was scoring hits, but the damage assessment was unclear. The Chikuma was a beast, absorbing the blows and continuing to close the distance. The economic disparity of the fight became apparent at 7:52 a.m. The Chikuma, annoyed by the pest stinging her, shifted her main battery fire from the carriers to the Roberts. The volume of incoming fire increased exponentially. 8-inch shells began landing, with terrifying precision. One exploded 30 yards to port, sending jagged shrapnel peppering the Roberts' thin hull. Another landed 20 yards to starboard, the blast wave rocking the ship so violently that men were thrown from their feet. A third shell hit the water just 10 yards off the bow. The massive splash drenched the forward gun mount, sending tons of seawater pouring through the gun ports. Inside, Burton's crew kept firing. Water sloshed around their boots, mixing with hydraulic fluid and sweat. The gun mechanism was designed to operate. Wet destroyers are wet ships by nature, but this was extreme. They were fighting in a flooding steel box, deafened by their own gun and the explosions outside. Yet, their discipline held. They had trained in simulated flooding. Now they were executing in reality. The Japanese were getting the range, dialing in the coordinates that would end the Roberts' life. To understand the precariousness of their situation, we must look at the rest of the screen. At 8:03 a.m., the destroyer Johnston, the first to charge, took a catastrophic hit from the battleship Congo. A 14-inch shell struck her bridge directly. The kinetic energy of the impact was immense. The explosion killed the executive officer and severely wounded Commander Evans. The Johnston's speed dropped to 17 knots as her engineering spaces struggled. 3 miles to the north, the destroyer Hull was engaged with the heavy cruiser Haguro. Hull had already taken multiple hits, her forward gun destroyed, her number 3 engine room flooded. She was limping at 15 knots on one engine. The American screen was being dismantled, piece by piece. The Roberts remained the only fully combat-effective ship in the screen, still making 28 knots. Still maneuvering. But she faced a critical shortage that courage could not overcome: ammunition. After 18 minutes of continuous, rapid-fire engagement, Lieutenant Burton had expended 270 rounds from the forward gun. That was 90% of that mount's total allocation. He had 34 rounds remaining. At the current rate of fire, the Roberts' primary weapon would fall silent in exactly 2 minutes and 16 seconds. They were winning the moral fight, but they were losing the logistical war. The silence was coming, and with it, the inevitable end. At 8:07 a.m., the tactical situation aboard the Samuel B. Roberts shifted from desperate to suicidal. Lieutenant Commander Copeland, observing the fall of shot, realized the heavy cruiser Tone had closed to within 7,000 yards. Tone was a more immediate threat than Chikuma. She mounted 8 8-inch guns and was pouring fire onto the escort carrier Gambier Bay. The American carrier was slow, fat, and defenseless, her flight deck crowded with aircraft that could not launch. Copeland ordered Lieutenant Burton to shift targets. The Roberts was now going to punch above her weight class yet again. Burton traversed his forward gun mount to the new bearing. The mechanics of this engagement were ludicrous. A destroyer escort's 5-inch gun is a pea-shooter compared to the heavy armor of a cruiser. Yet, Burton didn't hesitate. He elevated for 7,000 yards and fired. The first shell arched high, landing short. He adjusted, fired again. The third shell found its mark. It struck the Tone's number 2 main battery turret. Here, we witness a statistical anomaly that defies naval engineering. The 5-inch shell, weighing 54 pounds, struck the armored faceplate of a turret designed to withstand hits from other cruisers. By all rights, it should have bounced off. Instead, it penetrated the complex mechanism or jammed the armored glacis, detonating inside or jamming the gears. The massive turret stopped rotating. It stopped firing. With a single, well-placed shot from a tin-can destroyer, Burton had just disabled 25% of a heavy cruiser's offensive firepower. It was the equivalent of a soldier with a handgun disabling a tank. But at 8:10 a.m., the laws of logistics finally caught up with the Roberts. The forward gun fired its last round. Lieutenant Burton had expended 304 shells in roughly 25 minutes. The barrel was scorching hot, glowing a dull, ominous red in the dim light of the gun mount. The recoil mechanism, hammered beyond its design limits, was failing. The springs were compressed, and oil was smoking in the recuperator cylinders. They had pushed the machine until it broke. Silence fell over the forward mount. They were effectively out of the war. The fight now transferred to the aft of the ship. Gunner's mate, 3rd Class Paul Henry Carr, a 20-year-old from Checkaw, Oklahoma, commanded the aft 5-inch gun mount. Carr was a product of the hasty wartime mobilization. He had joined the Navy in May 1942 and had only been aboard the Roberts for 6 months. This was his first surface action. Yet, his leadership was absolute. His crew of 10 men, averaging 21 years old, still had ammunition 325 rounds. They had been firing continuously since 7:45 a.m., but they had conserved just enough to keep the Roberts in the fight. Carr's gun was now the only thing keeping the Japanese cruisers at bay. But at 8:15 a.m., the Roberts' luck, which had held for an hour of impossible combat, finally ran out. The Japanese fleet had successfully triangulated her position. 3 heavy cruisers, Chikuma, Tone, and Haguro, had her bracketed. This is a terrifying term in naval artillery. It means the enemy has landed shells on both sides of your ship and has calculated the exact range. The Roberts was running out of sea room, running out of smoke, and running out of time. At 8:20 a.m., the first major blow landed. An 8-inch shell from Chikuma slammed into the Roberts amidships on the port side. The ballistics of this impact reveal a dark irony of destroyer design. The Roberts was so thinly armored that the Japanese armor-piercing shell did not encounter enough resistance to trigger its fuse. It punched through the thin hull plating, traveled through the galley, and exited the starboard side without detonating. It left a clean, 3-foot-wide hole through the ship. Seawater rushed into the lower decks. But the ship did not explode. The Roberts survived solely because she was too weak to trigger the enemy's weapon. Damage control teams rushed to the breach. In a scene of desperate improvisation, sailors stuffed mattresses into the jagged holes and shored up buckled bulkheads with timber. The ship took on a 5-degree list to port, sluggishly fighting the rudder. But 2 minutes later, the physics changed. A second shell hit. This one found resistance. It detonated deep inside the ship, tearing through the crew's berthing compartment. The explosion killed 6 men instantly and ruptured the high-pressure steam lines. Superheated steam, invisible and lethal, filled the passageways. It scalded 4 more sailors to death before they could reach the ladders. In the engine room, the pressure dropped catastrophically. The Roberts' speed bled away from 28 knots to 24, then 20. One boiler was offline. Chief Engineer Trowbridge was now fighting a losing battle to keep the remaining boiler from failing. Without speed, the Roberts was a sitting duck. At 8:25 a.m., the damage severed the electrical cables running to the aft of the ship. Inside Paul Carr's gun mount, the lights flickered and died. The low hum of the hydraulic motors that rotated the turret and lifted the heavy shells silenced. The power train was dead. The gun was now a hunk of dead metal, or it should have been. But the U.S. Navy's training doctrine anticipated this moment. Every destroyer escort crew was drilled in local control. It meant manual operation. It meant muscle. The trainer and pointer had to hand-crank the heavy mount to aim at the moving targets on the horizon. The loader and rammer had to manually lift each 54-pound shell from the deck, lift it to the breech, and ram it home by hand, a task usually done by a hydraulic ram. The rate of fire dropped from 15 rounds per minute to 6. Carr's crew did not flinch. They began the brutal, rhythmic labor of manual firing. Crank, lift, load, ram, fire, the recoil mechanism, without power assist, absorbed 8 tons of backward force, shaking the mount so violently that the deck plates began to bend. The temperature inside the steel box soared to 1 30 degrees Fahrenheit. The men were soaking wet sweat, seawater from near misses, and the condensation of terror. They were firing at the heavy cruiser tone, refusing to yield. They were no longer fighting for a strategic objective. They were fighting for the man standing next to them, and they were about to pay the ultimate price. By 8:30 a.m., the aft gun mount of the Samuel B. Roberts had become a crucible. The temperature inside the steel casing had spiked well past safety limits. The gun barrel, having fired continuously for 45 minutes, was radiating intense heat back into the breech mechanism. In naval artillery, this creates a deadly phenomenon known as cook-off. When a powder charge is rammed into an overheated breech, the ambient heat alone can ignite the propellant before the breech block is closed and locked. It is a catastrophic failure of thermodynamics. Disaster struck. As the crew rammed a shell home, the propellant ignited spontaneously. The explosion was contained within the mount, amplifying its lethality. The blast tore through the confined space, killing 3 men instantly and turning the interior into a shrapnel-filled kill box. The force threw Paul Carr backward against the steel bulkhead. A jagged piece of the destroyed mechanism caught him from neck to groin, inflicting a wound that was clinically fatal. He collapsed onto the deck, his body broken, his intestines exposed. But the human will is sometimes stronger than physiology. Carr did not lose consciousness. In a display of grit that defies medical explanation, he crawled toward the ammunition rack. 1 shell remained the last round in the magazine. It weighed 54 pounds. Carr, bleeding out and unable to stand, dragged it toward his chest. He held it there, looking at the shattered breech, looking at his surviving crew. Machinist's mate, 2nd class, Chalmer Gowan, entered the mount and found Carr cradling the shell. Gowan tried to lift the gun captain, to evacuate him from the smoking ruin. Carr refused. He kept pointing at the breech, trying to make Gowan understand. The gun must fire. The fight is not over. Gowan gently took the shell from Carr's hands and set it down. He had to drag Carr away from the mount. The gun was destroyed. The firing mechanism was fused. There was no way to fire that last shell. Paul Carr died minutes later, his mind still fixed on the mission, his body having given everything it possessed to the United States Navy. At 8:35 a.m., the Roberts received the coup de grace. A 14-inch high-explosive shell, likely from the battleship Congo, struck the starboard side. It penetrated the No. 2 engine room and detonated. The physics of this impact were absolute. The explosion tore a hole 40 feet long and 10 feet wide in the hull. It was a mortal wound. The ocean rushed in with the force of a tidal wave, flooding the engine room in 30 seconds. 8 men were vaporized or drowned instantly. The ship's speed dropped from a sluggish 10 knots to dead in the water. The Roberts had lost all power. She had lost all steering. 3 feet of water sloshed through the lower decks. Fires were burning out of control in 4 compartments. The destroyer escort began to settle by the stern. She was dying. At 8:45 a.m., the Japanese cruisers, now realizing the target was stationary, closed in for target practice. 6-inch rounds from the light cruiser Noshiro and 8-inch rounds from Haguro pummeled the helpless hulk. Each hit killed more men, turning the Roberts into a charnel house. At 9:10 a.m., Lieutenant Commander Copeland gave the order that no captain ever wants to give. Abandoned ship. The cost of the battle was already staggering. 115 men were dead or missing. The remaining 109 sailors began to go over the side. The logistics of survival were grim. They had 3 inflatable life rafts. 2 had been shredded by shrapnel. Only 1 remained. Designed to hold 16 men, Copeland ordered the critically wounded into the raft. Everyone else went into the water. They clung to 3 floater nets, mesh nets kept on deck for this exact purpose, or held onto debris, empty shell casings, and wooden planks. At 9:35 a.m., the Samuel B. Roberts made her final maneuver. She rolled to port, her bow rising defiantly out of the water, pointing straight at the sky. She hung there for 10 seconds, a tombstone for the men trapped inside, before slipping beneath the surface, stern first. 306 feet of American warship disappeared into the Philippine Sea. She did not just sink, she vanished into the abyss. The Roberts went down over the Emden Deep, plunging 22,621 feet over 4 miles down. It is the deepest grave of any ship sunk in combat in human history. But as the survivors treaded water, a miracle of strategic psychology occurred. At 9:45 a.m., Admiral Takeo Kurita, commander of the Japanese Center Force, ordered a general withdrawal. His fleet was battered. His cruisers, Chokai, Chikuma, and Suzuya, were sinking or critically damaged. He looked at the ferocity of the American defense, the aggressive torpedo runs, the relentless gunfire, the air attacks from the escort carriers, and he made a fatal miscalculation. Kurita believed he was fighting Admiral Halsey's main carrier fleet. He could not conceive that a handful of destroyer escorts and jeep carriers would fight with such suicidal aggression. The fog of war had blinded him. He believed he was walking into a trap. In reality, the way to Leyte Gulf was open. He could have proceeded south and annihilated the invasion fleet. Instead, broken by the resistance of Taffy 3, he turned north. The Samuel B. Roberts had done the impossible. Along with her sisters in Taffy 3, she had bluffed the Imperial Japanese Navy into retreating. But for the 109 men floating in the oil-slicked water, the victory was hollow. The Japanese were gone, but the ocean remained. Silence settled over the Pacific. No engines, no gunfire, just the sound of waves lapping against life jackets. The men were covered in thick, black fuel oil from the Roberts' ruptured tanks. It coated their eyes, causing temporary blindness and agonizing stinging. It coated their lungs, causing them to vomit violently. The water was 84 degrees, warm enough to survive initially, but dehydration and exposure were the new enemies. And they were not alone. At 2 p.m., the first dorsal fin broke the surface. Blacktip reef sharks, 6 feet long, began to circle. They were investigating the scent of blood and oil. The battle against the Japanese was over. The battle against nature had just begun. The ordeal of the survivors of the Samuel B. Roberts is a study in the psychological limits of human endurance. By the afternoon of October 25th, the Philippine Sea had transformed from a battlefield into a feeding ground. The sharks that arrived were initially cautious, blacktip reef sharks, roughly 6 feet in length. They engaged in bump and bite tactics, nudging the floating men to test for resistance. The thick, cloying fuel oil that coated the sailors likely saved many of them initially. The taste and smell were repulsive even to apex predators. But as the oil washed away, the danger escalated. Larger species arrived as the sun began to set. Tiger sharks and bull sharks, drawn by the acoustic vibrations of thrashing men and the scent of blood from the wounded. The terror was psychological as much as physical. Survivors reported men simply disappearing. There would be a sudden splash, a brief struggle, and then silence. No one wanted to acknowledge what had happened. To acknowledge it was to invite panic, and panic meant death. Nightfall brought a new enemy, thermodynamics. While the water was 84 degrees, water conducts heat away from the body 25 times faster than air. After 12 hours of immersion, the core body temperature of the wounded began to drop. Hypothermia set in, subtle and insidious. Men stopped shivering. They became lethargic. Their speech slurred. 3 men died during that first night, succumbing to the lethal combination of shock, blood loss, and exposure. Their bodies were gently pushed away from the raft, drifting off into the phosphorescent darkness to be claimed by the sea. October 26 brought the sun, and with it, the agony of dehydration. The human body can survive weeks without food, but without fresh water. In a saline environment, the clock is short. Men began to hallucinate. The brain, starved of electrolytes and baked by the equatorial sun, began to fabricate reality. Some sailors saw islands that weren't there. Others saw fresh water springs bubbling up from the ocean. Some believed they were back in San Francisco. Captain Copeland, floating in a life jacket, wounded and exhausted, refused to let his command disintegrate. He organized the men into pods. He implemented a buddy system, forcing them to count off every hour. If a man didn't respond, he was shaken awake, bullied back to life. Copeland knew that sleep was the precursor to death. If a man's head dipped below the surface, the salt water would fill his lungs in seconds. Of the 14 men who died in the water over those 3 days, many simply drifted away into a coma and slipped under. But 95 men survived because Copeland and the petty officers enforced a rigid discipline in a chaotic hellscape. Rescue came not a moment too soon. At 7:45 a.m., on October 27th, 50 hours after the Roberts sank, a lookout aboard the patrol craft, PC-1119, spotted debris. The craft approached cautiously. In this theater of war, Japanese survivors were known to feign death, to lure rescuers into ambush range. The captain of the patrol craft cut his engines 50 yards out and shouted a challenge across the water. A cultural shibboleth that no Japanese soldier would know. Who won the World Series? A cracked, parched American voice yelled back the answer. The St. Louis Cardinals. The rescue took 4 hours. Men had to be hauled aboard in nets. Their skin was so ulcerated by salt water and oil that they could not be touched without screaming. They were living skeletons, but they were alive. The battle off Samar was over. The statistics of the engagement were soberingly brutal. The Roberts, along with the destroyers Johnston and Howell, and the carrier Gambier Bay, lay at the bottom of the ocean. 1,277 Americans were dead or missing, but statistically, their sacrifice was the most efficient trade in naval history. 7 small ships had blunted the spearhead of the Imperial Japanese Navy, saving the invasion fleet of General MacArthur. The legacy of the Samuel B. Roberts did not end in 1944. It was resurrected by technology nearly 80 years later. In June 2022, explorer Victor Vescovo, piloting the deep submergence vehicle Limiting Factor, descended into the Emden Deep. He was hunting for the Sammy B. The physics of this dive are hard to comprehend. At 22,621 feet, 4.3 miles down, the pressure is 600 times greater than at the surface. It is a crushing darkness where life barely exists. There, in the gloom, Vescovo's lights illuminated the steel corpse of the destroyer escort. The Roberts hit the bottom with such force that her bow is somewhat crumpled, but she sits upright, dignified in her grave. She is the deepest shipwreck ever discovered, resting deeper than the Titanic by several miles. The high-definition footage brought back a haunting image. The aft 5-inch gun mount, the station of gunner's mate Paul Henry Carr, is still there. The blast damage from the breech explosion is visible. The mount is a silent testament to the final moments of a 20-year-old boy who refused to stop fighting. It stands as a monument to the sheer, unadulterated grit of the greatest generation. Historian Samuel Eliot Morison later wrote that no engagement in its entire history has the United States Navy shown more gallantry, guts, and gumption than in those 2 morning hours between 0730 and 0930 off Samar. The Samuel B. Roberts was a disposable ship, built to last for the duration of hostilities and then be scrapped. Instead, she fought like a battleship and achieved immortality. The last survivor of the Roberts, Adred Lenoir, passed away on March 20th, 2022, at the age of 97. He died just 3 months before Vescovo found his ship. The human connection to the battle has now faded into history, leaving only the steel on the ocean floor and the story of what happened when a tin can destroyer charged the largest battleship on Earth. This was the Battle of Samar, a tactical defeat, but a strategic masterstroke paid for in blood. It reminds us that in the calculus of geopolitics and war, equipment matters, tonnage matters. But ultimately, the variable that cannot be quantified is the human spirit.